She thought that morning would change her life, and it did, just not the way she expected. At 28 years old, Claire Dawson had one fragile piece of hope left. A final job interview that could pull her out of debt, out of survival mode, and into a real, stable life. She wore her only decent outfit, wrapped a simple blue scarf tight against the chill, clutched her resume like a lifeline, and walked through the cold autumn streets with a future she was terrified to believe in. But just 7 blocks from the building, she heard a scream, and by the time the sun went down that evening, Claire's entire future had been erased and rewritten, because in the underworld, saving a life creates a debt that isn't paid with money, but with protection, secrets, surveillance, and choices that never come without consequences. This is the story of a woman who lost her one chance at a normal life, simply because she chose to do the right thing, and in return, she found something far more dangerous, far more complicated, and far more powerful than the life she thought she wanted. She found a purpose, she found loyalty, and she found herself in the one world she never meant to enter. If you are listening to this and feel that the story touches something quiet and unspoken inside you, take a moment to subscribe to our channel, to like and share this video so we can continue bringing heartfelt stories every single day. And if it is not too much to ask, tell me where you are watching from and leave a comment below so we know which corner of the world this story has reached, because we treasure every word you share with us. Claire arrived when the interview had already been underway for 15 minutes. She stood in front of the towering glass building, her hands still trembling slightly from the aftershock of what had just happened in the dark alley, her heart pounding not only from running but from the haunting image of the blood-soaked man that refused to leave her mind. She drew in a deep breath and forced herself to step inside as if nothing had happened, as if her life were still neatly contained in the resume folder pressed against her chest. But the moment she reached the reception desk, the receptionist's expression shifted instantly from neutral to cool. "Miss Dawson, right?" The voice was light but final. "Your interview has already ended." The hiring team waited as long as they could. Claire tried to explain that she had stopped a kidnapping, that the terrified child wouldn't let go of her hand until the police arrived. But inside the polished professionalism of that building, her words sounded more like a clumsy excuse than a truth worthy of compassion. The human resources manager stepped out, polite yet distant, and said they were sorry, but the opportunity had been given to another candidate, because being late showed a lack of commitment and responsibility. In just a few short sentences, the last door Claire had clung to for months was officially closed. She walked out of the building, hollowed out inside, her steps unbearably heavy, as if each stair carried away another piece of the hope she had held so tightly. The sky had grown darker than when she arrived, and the wind cut coldly through the long streets. She sat down on a bench near the bus stop, gripping the now meaningless folder in her hands, her throat tight but unable to cry. She had saved a life, yet she had lost her own chance at survival in this world. No emergency savings, no job, no one to call. Every plan she had carefully built for over a year collapsed in a single morning. By evening, when she returned to the narrow rented room on the west side of the city, Claire finally felt the full weight of failure. The ceiling light flickered, the walls peeled, the familiar damp smell made her dizzy. She dropped her bag on the floor, sat heavily on the bed, and stared at the opposite wall as if it might hold the answers to everything. Her phone vibrated once with a bank notification saying her balance was only enough for a few meals and half a month of rent. She let out a dry laugh, a laugh without joy, only the bitter mockery of fate. She thought of the terrified eyes of the little boy, his small hands clinging to her like a final thread of life. If time could be turned back, she would still run into that alley again. But the truth was that the price of doing the right thing now was far higher than anything she had ever imagined. Night fell quickly, the city lit up, but in Claire's tiny room there was only darkness and the distant echo of traffic. She lay on her side on the bed, still wearing her shoes, with no strength to eat, letting exhaustion rise over her like a heavy tide. For the first time in many years, she allowed herself to admit that she had run out of retreat. Doing what was right had brought no immediate reward, only emptiness, and a suffocating sense of injustice. She did not know that she had unknowingly stepped into a much larger spiral, where the price of her choice that morning was only the beginning. 3 days later, Claire was still trapped in a hazy space between two worlds. On one side was the brutal reality of unemployment and mounting bills. On the other was the vivid memory of the fateful morning when she saved the life of a stranger. Everything returned to an unnatural quiet, so quiet that she began to wonder if she had imagined it all, until the knock on the door came. It was nearly 9 in the morning. Claire was still in her worn-out pajamas, hair tangled, teeth unbrushed, She was not expecting anyone. Peering through the peephole, she saw a man in a gray suit, a stranger, but his eyes were not those of a delivery worker or a marketer. She opened the door just a crack and asked cautiously. The man handed her an embossed business card, with only one simple line printed on it. Dominic Russo, personal representative of Nicholas Marino. Claire froze for several seconds, as if she had been dragged back into the whirlwind she thought had already passed. Thank her for saving his son, and that a car was waiting outside if she agreed. Every instinct of caution in Claire surged at once, but her intuition told her this was not a threat. Dominic spoke calmly, without haste, without pressure. And when she glanced down the narrow alley outside her worn-out apartment, the luxurious black sedan waiting there seemed to belong to an entirely different world. Claire changed quickly, slipping a small folding knife into the pocket of her old coat. On the way, Dominic said nothing more, keeping his eyes on the road, leaving her alone with the tangle of thoughts about why a man like Nicholas Marino wanted to meet her, and whether saving his life had pulled her into something far larger than herself. The car stopped in front of a classic cafe, nestled in the heart of an upscale commercial district, a place Claire never imagined she would step into. Inside, warm light and the rich scent of roasted coffee filled the quiet, refined air. Dominic led her to a table in the far back corner. Nicholas Marino was already there. He no longer bore the pale, chaotic look of that morning. Now he appeared composed and commanding. A perfectly fitted dark blue suit, an expensive watch, hair neatly styled. But what caught Claire's attention most was his eyes, clear, controlled. Claire was about to speak, but Nick spoke first. His voice was low, slightly rough, but steady. He said not everyone would have done what she did, that she had saved his life, and that he would not forget it. Claire leaned back slightly in her chair, unsure how to feel about gratitude coming from a man who was likely no stranger to blood and shadows. Nick said he only wanted to thank her, nothing more, and that she was free to leave at any time if she felt uncomfortable. Then he placed a thick envelope on the table and said it was to compensate her for the job she had lost because of helping him. Claire looked at the envelope, then met his eyes directly. She thanked him, but refused. She did not want to sell her kindness. Nick fell silent for a few seconds, then gave a faint smile, without any trace of anger. He signaled to Dominic, who quietly withdrew the envelope. Before leaving, Claire turned back and asked a question that surprised even herself as it left her lips. Why was his son alone that morning? Nick laughed, this time with something more genuine in it. He said sometimes people believe themselves untouchable, until they are not. The meeting ended with a brief handshake, but in both their eyes there was something left unnamed. Claire did not know what would come next, but she felt it clearly. This was not the end. This was only the opening chapter of something far greater than she had imagined. Claire believed that meeting would be nothing more than a thank you, a brief surprise, and then their paths would part. But less than 24 hours later, Dominic returned. This time he was not standing politely at her door. He was waiting across the street, leaning against the familiar black car, his gaze no longer neutral, but urgent. He said Nick needed to see her again, immediately. She meant to refuse, but something inside her made her step into the car, not out of curiosity, but because her instincts were sounding an alarm. This time they did not go to the cafe. They drove farther, turning into a quiet private residential area at the edge of the city. The villa was not lavish, but discreet and tightly guarded. Claire was led into a dark wood-paneled living room, where Nick stood with his back to the large window, holding a glass of liquor but clearly not drinking it. He turned at the sound of her footsteps, his gaze sharper than before. The polite distance of their previous meeting was gone. This time, he went straight to the point. He looked at her, the mask of the crime lord slipping to reveal a desperate father. I am not just here to repay you, Claire. I am here to hire you. Since the incident, Leo hasn't spoken a word. He refuses to eat. He wakes up screaming for the lady with the blue scarf. That's you. I can buy anything in this city, but I cannot buy my son's peace. Only you can give him that. Come live at the villa. Be his nanny. Be his guardian. Name your price. Claire looked at the man standing before her. She wanted to say no. She wanted to run back to her small peeling room and pretend none of this had happened. But then she thought of the boy. She remembered how Leo's small hands had gripped her coat in the alley, shaking violently, his eyes begging her not to let go. She wasn't just saving a stranger anymore. She was the only anchor for a drowning child. I don't want your money, Mr. Marino, Claire said, her voice trembling but resolute. And I don't want to be part of your world, but I won't leave a child in pain. If Leo needs me, I will stay. Nick exhaled, a tension he hadn't realized he was holding, releasing from his shoulders. He nodded, his eyes losing their sharp edge for a fraction of a second. "Thank you," he said simply. "But I have conditions," Claire added, straightening her spine. "I am here for Leo, not for you, and I need to know that while I am in this house, I am not a prisoner." "You have my word," Nick replied, though his expression darkened slightly. "Inside these walls, you are free. But outside, Claire, you are now a target. Because you saved my son, my enemies know your face. Staying here isn't just for Leo's sanity, it's for your survival." Claire felt a chill run down her spine. She realized then that she hadn't just accepted a job, she had stepped into a cage. A gilded, luxurious cage, but a cage nonetheless. And now, there was no turning back. 3 days after leaving Nick Marino's villa, Claire began to feel that something was wrong. At first it was only a strange sensation while she walked along the corridor of her boarding house, as if some unseen eyes were fixed on her back. She turned around. There was no one there. At the supermarket, she noticed a man in a gray hoodie standing near the checkout counter. He did not buy anything. He simply stood there, silently watching her from behind the candy shelves. When she hurried outside, he was still standing in the same place. Claire tried to reason with herself that she was overly tense, that the warning she had received had made her hypersensitive to every small detail. But the feeling of being watched did not fade. It clung to her like a thick mist, seeping into every step she took, every door she opened, every streetlight that flickered on when night fell. The breaking point came that very evening, when she returned to her familiar rented room. There were no signs of forced entry. The lock was still intact, but when she turned on the light, the sight before her left her frozen. The small room looked as if it had just been subjected to an unofficial search. The wooden wardrobe stood wide open. The drawers were in disarray. Her few pieces of clothing were scattered across the floor. The small box holding her personal documents lay overturned, its lid popped open. Everything inside had been rummaged through. Some of the papers were even slightly torn at the edges. Claire stepped back, her heart racing, her hand gripping her phone. She was about to call Dominic immediately, but her gaze stopped on the small wooden table beside the bed. On it lay a piece of paper, placed neatly, as if someone wanted to be certain she would see it. A plain white sheet, messy handwriting in black marker, only one short line. "You should have kept going." Claire stood motionless. The piece of paper seemed to weigh heavily in the air. There was no signature, no explanation, yet the message was unmistakably clear. Someone had been here. Someone had torn through her life, and they had left behind a warning that could not be misread. She had been warned, not by Nick, by someone else. Someone who was watching her. Someone who wanted her gone. She slowly backed toward the door, locking it with trembling hands, then called Dominic. He answered after the first ring. His voice was not surprised. It only grew lower. Claire managed to say only that someone had been in her room before Dominic told her she could not stay there another minute. 15 minutes later, a different car arrived to pick her up. This time it was not the glossy black sedan, but a matte gray SUV with dark-tinted windows. The man driving did not speak. He only nodded in greeting. Claire sat in the back seat, still clutching the piece of paper, as if it were fragile proof that what she had just lived through was real. The car sped toward the city limits, finally turning onto a private road that led straight to the heavy iron gates of the Marino estate. Inside the fortified mansion, everything was tightly controlled. Cameras covered every corner. Steel doors stood solid and unmoving. There was even a separate control room filled with surveillance screens. Dominic was waiting. For the first time, he was not wearing a suit, only a dark turtleneck sweater. He looked at Claire with calm eyes that no longer concealed their vigilance. She handed him the piece of paper. Dominic scanned it, then nodded as if confirming something he already knew. He said this was the first serious warning, and that they should have anticipated it. When Claire asked who it was, Dominic replied only that they were investigating, but that it could be one of the groups outside their network. Claire asked again what he meant by we. He did not answer directly. He said only one sentence that made her chest tighten. "You have stepped into deep water, Claire. And in that water, no one survives by swimming alone." Claire sat down in the leather chair by the window. For the first time in her life, she no longer knew what tomorrow would look like. Not only no job, no direction, but the terrifying uncertainty of whether she would even live to see the next day. The presence of darkness was no longer a metaphor. It was real. It was lurking just beyond this very door, and it seemed that everything was only just beginning. Claire woke up the next morning in a room that was suffocatingly large. Silk curtains blocked the sunlight, and the air smelled of expensive polish and old money. It took her a few seconds to remember where she was. Not her old apartment, not a safe house. She was in the fortified safe room of the Marino estate, accessible only by a private elevator near Leo's room. Everything inside was minimal but modern, clearly designed for protection rather than comfort. There were no windows, no doorbell. The security system ran continuously. There was even an emergency red alarm button fixed beside the head of the bed. Claire stepped out of the bedroom, the only place that held even a trace of personal space. The living area and kitchen were connected in a small open layout. Only a few basic pieces of furniture rested there, but everything was strangely clean and orderly, as if no one had ever stayed longer than a few days at a time. On the dining table sat a tray of still warm breakfast food and a small note in neat handwriting. "If you need anything else, call the number on the phone. Nick." Claire set the note down. A feeling she could not quite name welled up inside her. She did not know whether to feel grateful for the thoughtfulness or afraid of being monitored so closely. She tried calling the number on the phone, just to check, and was not surprised when Dominic answered. His voice was steady and polite. He informed her that she would stay here for a few days, that someone would bring her clothes and supplies, and that if she wanted to see Nick, he was at a nearby location. Claire did not answer right away. She did not want to admit it, but the fear from the day before still had not faded. Something in Dominic's eyes, in the cold silence of this shelter, told her that what had happened was only the beginning. That afternoon, Nick arrived. There was no advance notice, no noise. Claire heard a soft knock on the metal door, then saw him step inside, wearing a dark brown coat. His appearance had not changed, but his eyes had. He glanced around the apartment, then turned to her and asked calmly if she was all right. Claire lifted her gaze, guarded. "I am living underground, monitored 24 hours a day. I suppose that counts as being all right, in a way." Nick did not smile, nor did he seem offended. He simply sat down in the chair across from her, keeping just enough distance so that she would not feel invaded. He said he knew it was uncomfortable, but if anyone wanted to harm her, they would have to pass through many layers to reach this place. Claire folded her arms across her chest and studied him closely. "Why?" she asked. "Why are you doing all of this?" "I am just an anonymous woman who happened to be there at the right moment. No more than that." Nick looked at her for a long time before answering. He said she was the only person in 30 years who had chosen to run into danger for him. Not for money, not for power, not out of fear, only because she believed it was the right thing to do. To him, that had value. The answer made Claire hesitate. She did not know how to respond. For the first time, his words did not sound calculating. There was something sincere in his voice, almost bare. They sat in silence for a while. There was still distance between them, but the cold tension had softened. Claire poured 2 cups of tea from the hot water dispenser on the table and handed one to Nick. He took it without a word. In that moment, something began to shift. Not trust yet, not alliance either, but a quiet acknowledgement that they were both inside a game they did not fully control. Claire took a sip of tea. It tasted slightly bitter. She was still not sure whether this place was truly a refuge or merely a prison wrapped in polished walls. But at least, in this moment, she was no longer alone. And without saying it, both of them knew that the existence of the other had now become part of the equation that determined their survival. On the 3rd evening in the underground apartment, Claire and Nick sat facing each other under the soft glow of a small table lamp. The room sank into silence for a long while after the simple dinner Dominic had sent over. Claire was the one who broke the quiet. She set her teacup down, her eyes fixed steadily on Nick as she asked in a calm but resolute voice why he had said this was not only about gratitude and what it was truly about. Nick lifted his head and looked at her for a moment, then nodded slowly as if he had been ready for that question. He leaned back, his hands clasped together on his lap, and began to speak without circling around the truth. He said that in his world, where the law was only a thin coat of paint, there were unspoken rules stronger than any official statute. One of them was the debt of blood, a bond not written on paper but sealed with life itself. The person who saved the life of a member of a Mafia family, especially someone in a position like his, would be recorded forever. No one was allowed to harm that person. No one was allowed to abandon that person. Claire frowned as she listened and said it sounded as though she had been tied to something she had never agreed to. Nick nodded without denying it. He said that she had not chosen this, just as he had not chosen to be stabbed in broad daylight. Everything that happened carried consequences. And in his culture, life was the greatest debt of all. When she saved him, she had not only saved a man, She had unknowingly created a bond that neither of them could easily undo. Claire folded her arms, her gaze sharp. And what was she supposed to do now? Owe him for the rest of her life? Become someone indebted to the Mafia? Nick shook his head. Not indebted, he said, but now she existed within a system she had never known about before, and could not step out of without leaving consequences behind. If he allowed her complete freedom, it would mean leaving her alone when those who hated him came looking. She could become a target simply for having once brushed against his life. Claire fell silent for a long time. Nick's words did not sound like a threat, yet each sentence was a truth she was forced to face. She thought of the piece of paper with the words "you should have kept going," the cold stare of the stranger in the supermarket, the ransacked room of her boarding house. It was not imagination. It was not paranoia. She had been pulled in, whether she wanted it or not. Nick continued, his voice low and even, as though he were speaking of family tradition rather than a blood-soaked rule. He said that in his family, if someone saved the life of a person bearing the Merino blood, then ever since his great-grandfather's time there had been an unwritten law. That person would be protected for life, no matter who they were. But at the same time, they could never simply disappear. They became part of the network, whether on the edge or at the center. Claire let out a faint, humorless laugh and asked what she was then. A debt of honor, a temporary asset. Nick did not grow angry. He tilted his head slightly and looked at her. He said she was the only one who had chosen not to turn away. In this world, that was both a gift and a burden. He had no intention of controlling her, but he also could not look away while her name was being marked. Claire drew in a deep breath, struggling to stay calm. She did not want to believe that her life had veered onto this path because of a single humane act that lasted barely 10 seconds that morning. But the truth was that from that moment on, everything had changed, and now she stood before a nameless choice: to remain beneath the protection and the watchful eyes of a dark world, or to step away from it and face a danger that might never allow her to see the light again. Either way, she was no longer Claire Dawson as she had once been. Claire gradually realized that this underground apartment was not a refuge, but a velvet-lined cage. Everything inside it was clean, convenient, and controlled with perfect precision. Yet it was that very perfection that made her feel suffocated. She could not open a window, because there were no windows. She could not go anywhere without an escort. Even the simple wish to go for a run to release stress became a security issue. Every step she took, every room she entered, was watched by cameras. Claire knew it. Even though Dominic never said it outright, the way his eyes slid over the small devices fixed into the walls, the way the furniture was arranged so that no angle could escape view, all told her that privacy here was a luxury. Even when she slept, she could not be certain whether she was being observed or not. Safety, even if it was real, brought with it a cold loneliness that Claire had never known before. She was used to living alone. But being alone while free was completely different from being alone while under surveillance. Each time she lifted her phone to call her former foster mother or a friend from her contact list, she stopped, thinking of the possibility that someone might be listening, not because she had anything to hide, but because she did not want anyone else to be dragged into this strange world. She began to stay up later, not from fear, but because she felt that if she surrendered to sleep, she would lose another small fragment of the last control she still possessed. In the mornings, she stood silently in the narrow kitchen, cradling a cup of coffee, staring at the blank white wall as if trying to look through it in search of a path back to her former life. But there was no path. Claire began to feel as if she were vanishing from herself. Her name no longer appeared in job applications. She had no social media activity. No one called to check on her. It was as though she had died on paper, leaving behind only the form of a woman hidden deep underground, guarded like a dangerous asset. But if she truly was being protected, why did it feel so much like imprisonment? One afternoon, when Dominic arrived with some of her personal belongings and an update on security, Claire asked him directly, her voice light but edged with steel, whether she was allowed to leave. Just for a while. She wanted to take a walk. Only a park, not far. Dominic hesitated for a few seconds, then shook his head. They had not yet identified who was behind the last threat. The risk remained. Claire tightened her grip around the arm of the chair. She did not argue, but her gaze closed like a door slamming shut. After Dominic left, she sat alone beneath the pale yellow light, feeling anger rise from the depths of her chest. Freedom and safety, two things that were meant to exist together, now stood as enemies, and she was forced to choose. But was it truly a choice, or only an illusion created to make her struggle less? She had once thought that losing her job was the lowest fall of her life. But now, with guards watching her day and night, with every smallest decision subject to approval, Claire finally understood that the feeling of being stripped of one's humanity began with very small things. That evening, she stood before the mirror in the bathroom and looked into her own eyes. There was no fear now, no anger either, only a deep and aching loneliness. She understood that Nick did not want her dead, but did he know that in order to survive in his world, she was being forced to accept another kind of death, slower, quieter, and perhaps even more impossible to escape than a bullet? In the days that followed, Claire spent most of her time with books. They were the only thing she could choose freely, without asking permission, without being controlled, and without creating risk. In the corner of the living area of the underground apartment stood a small bookshelf, where she discovered a few classic novels, several philosophy volumes, and even old printed editions of Hemingway. One late afternoon, when the main lights had dimmed and given way to the warm glow of the desk lamp, Claire was curled up in her chair rereading a long dialogue passage in For Whom the Bell Tolls when the door opened. She looked up and saw Nick step inside, quietly and without warning as he always did. Instead of a leather jacket or a dark suit, he wore a simple sweater, his hands in his pockets, his expression no longer cold but carrying something subdued and restrained. He said nothing, only took the chair opposite her and tilted his head slightly toward the book in her hands. Claire slowly closed the book, keeping her finger between the pages as a marker. They looked at each other for a moment. She spoke first, no longer with the defensive edge she once had, simply asking what he would like to drink. Nick shook his head, his eyes still resting on the book. After a few minutes of silence, he spoke, his voice lower than usual. He held a children's storybook in his hands, The Little Prince. His voice was low, filled with shame. I promised Leo I would read to him tonight, but I can't. He looked up at Claire, his eyes vulnerable. The letters. They swim. I run an empire, Claire, but I cannot read a bedtime story to my own son. He thinks I don't care. He doesn't know that his father is simply broken. It took him an extremely long time to understand a single passage. It had been that way since he was small. Claire was quiet for a moment, then gently asked if he had dyslexia. Nick nodded. He had been diagnosed when he was 8 years old. Teachers and tutors had all tried to help, but when people started telling a 10-year-old boy that he would never be good enough for college, he learned how to hide it. Claire felt something soften inside her. For the first time, she saw another side of the man she had always thought of as sharp and powerful. A child once rejected by the very standard society used to define worth, the ability to read with ease. She opened the book again, flipping to a passage she knew would not be easy for someone with language difficulties. She told him she would try to read it aloud instead, slowly, if he wanted. Nick did not speak, but the way he leaned just slightly toward her was enough for Claire to understand that it was a yes. She began to read, her voice gentle and steady, keeping the slowest pace she could manage. Whenever she reached a long sentence or a difficult word, she paused, explaining it briefly the way she once had with older students at the community center. Nick said very little, only listened, sometimes frowning, sometimes nodding, as though he were reorganizing the meaning inside his own mind. After 15 minutes, Claire closed the book. She asked if he understood. Nick looked at her, his gaze as serious as ever, but with something small and fragile shimmering beneath it. He said he did. For the first time in his life, he did not feel stupid reading something like that. Claire smiled softly, not in mockery, but with understanding and relief. She told him he had never been stupid. He had only needed someone with the right kind of patience. They sat together for a few more minutes in silence. No one said it aloud, but something between them had changed. No longer rescuer and the rescued. No longer the powerful man and the protected woman. Only two human beings, each carrying their own wounds, beginning to see one another in a different light. Claire did not know where this would lead, but she knew that in that brief moment, she no longer felt entirely isolated, and perhaps Nick no longer did either. The next morning, when Claire stepped into the small kitchen of the underground apartment, she found Nick standing alone at the coffee counter. No Dominic, no guards. The quiet was strange in its stillness. He wore a rolled-sleeve shirt, his hair slightly tousled, looking no different from an ordinary man preparing for an ordinary day, if not for the faint scar on his wrist and the constant vigilance in his eyes. Claire approached, took a ceramic cup from the hanging rack, and poured herself some black coffee. Neither of them spoke for several minutes, yet something in that silence was no longer as tense as before. She set her cup down on the table and suddenly asked, her voice light yet firm, whether he would like her to help him learn to read properly, in a structured way. Nick froze, his coffee cup suspended in midair, his eyebrows tightening slightly as he looked at her. He asked if she meant as a tutor. Claire nodded, not in a heavy academic way, just reading, comprehension, reaction, the way she had once done at the community education center, with older adults or with people who had never been given the chance to learn properly. Nick set his cup down, the sound sharp against the saucer. There is always a transaction, Claire. This morning I bought your debt from the bank. Every cent of your student loans, your credit cards. You don't owe them anymore. You owe me. Claire stood up, shock and anger flashing in her eyes. I didn't ask you to. I know, Nick interrupted calmly. But my enemies would have used that debt to get to you. I removed the leverage. He leaned forward, his gaze intense. But I don't give charity. You want to pay me back? Then teach me. That is the deal. Your time for your freedom. Claire looked at him, feeling the weight of his words. It was an offer she couldn't refuse, not if she wanted to survive with her dignity intact. She finally nodded. She was doing it not just to pay a debt, but because she knew what it felt like to be looked at as helpless, and no one deserved to carry that feeling for a lifetime. Her words left Nick completely silent. He set his cup down, then took the chair opposite her. The coldness was gone. So was the defensiveness. Only a serious attention remained. He said that he was not good at asking for help. Claire gave a faint smile. She said neither was she, but if both of them remained stubborn, neither would ever move forward. They began their first lesson right there at the dining table, without textbooks, without complex exercises. Claire took a simpler book from the shelf, a volume of short stories with concise sentences, and they read through each section together. She did not correct him too often. She did not interrupt him when he mispronounced a word. She waited until he stopped, then gently repeated the word, sound by sound. She understood the reactions of someone who had once been looked down on for learning slowly. She had seen that same look in the mirror many years ago, when a restaurant manager had tossed her job application into the trash because she misspelled a word. Nick read slowly, very slowly. He often stumbled over long or unfamiliar words, but he did not give up. She saw in him something deeply resilient, a fierce determination that did not need to be displayed outwardly. Once, after mispronouncing the word through 3 times in a row, he set the book down with a frustrated gesture and muttered that he would never be able to do it. Claire did not react immediately. She only looked at him, her eyes not filled with pity but with understanding. She told him that he thought she had never said that herself, that there were days when she could not understand a single tax form, days when she felt so foolish she wanted to disappear. But she had learned that no one was born knowing everything, and everyone deserved a chance to begin again. Nick was silent. Then he picked up the book, turned back to the previous page, and continued reading. There was no thank you, but his eyes had changed. In the days that followed, the lessons became a quiet part of their routine. No one named them. There was no fixed schedule. Yet almost every day there was a small session, sometimes in the morning before Dominic came for meetings, sometimes at night, when everything had finally settled. Claire saw Nick begin to read faster, not because he had suddenly become smarter, but because he had begun to believe that he could. And Nick, though he never said it aloud, began to look at Claire differently. No longer as a woman who needed protection, no longer as a stranger who had accidentally become indebted to his world, but as someone who understood him in a way that no one in his family or among his subordinates ever had. Between the cold concrete walls, they were not only learning how to pronounce words, they were learning how to see a human being beyond judgment. And from that, a new bond quietly began to take shape, silent yet unshakable. In the days that followed, time moved with a strangely quiet rhythm. Dominic arranged for Claire to be allowed outside within limited hours, always with someone accompanying her, yet it no longer felt like the heavy surveillance of before. They chose places that were quiet and unremarkable, mostly a small library in the northern suburbs or a discreet cafe with red brick walls and warm yellow light. Nick accompanied her to most of the lessons, not as a protector but as a patient and silent student. He sat across from her at the table, eyes fixed on the book, jotting down notes in a firm, deliberate hand. Claire felt something soften inside her each time they sat like that together. She no longer worried about the presence of cameras, about someone secretly watching her. With every page she turned, every passage she slowly read aloud for Nick, she felt her heartbeat returning to the rhythm of an ordinary life. One afternoon, as they sat in the library, and light rain brushed softly against the glass roof above them, Nick suddenly asked what she thought about one of the characters in the Hemingway story they were reading. Claire was surprised, not by the question itself, but because it was the first time he had asked something rooted in reflection rather than technique. She answered with an enthusiasm she could not hide. And from there they slid into a brief but deep conversation about the choice between honor and survival. From the lessons, they gradually began to talk more about things beyond books. Claire told him about her childhood in foster care, about working part-time at a bakery when she was 17, about the year she failed to enter university simply because she could not pay the tuition on time. Nick listened in silence, occasionally nodding or offering a short reply, but his gaze never wandered. Once, when she said that she had once believed she would never have the chance to do anything meaningful, Nick looked at her and said, calmly but with unshakable certainty, that without her he would likely be lying under cold ground by now. The lessons became a quiet habit. The small cafe they often visited grew familiar to the staff, who never asked questions about Nick, or about the two bodyguards who always sat several tables away. They understood discretion and kept silent, and Claire began to feel that place become a real part of her life. She wore her old wool coat, tied her hair neatly, carried a notebook always filled with blue ink. She became again the woman she had once hoped to be, someone with purpose, with responsibility, with someone waiting for her simply to read a few passages together and share a piece of the world. She knew this calm could not last forever. She was not naive. Nick's world was not a place where quiet could linger too long without consequence. Yet in those weeks, as autumn slipped into early winter, as morning frost began to blur the cafe windows and coats grew thicker each week, Claire allowed herself to believe that some form of normal was real. And if she could not call this freedom, then at least it was a pause, a breath. No one told the other that they were changing, but Claire began to sleep more soundly, and Nick, while still guarded and restrained, began to look toward the door less often each time someone entered. In that stillness, between two people who had once believed they had nothing left to lose, something delicate and genuine began to glow, like the first light of an ordinary day they had never dared to imagine. That afternoon, Claire stepped into the cafe as usual, but this time she could feel the tension thick in the watching eyes around her. As she settled at the familiar table, a group of young men appeared, carrying with them an air of aggression and excessive confidence. Before, she had retreated, endured, left without a word. This time, an unexpected force rose within her. She straightened, met the challenge in the leader's eyes, her voice firm and steady. She told them to leave her alone. She had done nothing wrong to them. Silence fell for a brief instant, but the tension did not ease. One of them scoffed and stepped closer, his voice mocking. He asked who she thought she was to lecture him. Claire shrugged, her eyes burning with resolve. She said she was someone who had survived far worse than their threats, and that she was not afraid of them. Her words startled not only the group but also drew the attention of a few patrons nearby. Another of the young men stepped forward with a taunt, but under the steadiness of Claire's gaze he faltered. She did not retreat. She drew a deep breath and took another step forward. She said she did not want to fight, but if they continued to harass her, she would do whatever was necessary to protect herself. From the corner of the cafe, Nick watched every movement. He had never seen her like this, so strong, so unyielding, daring to stand her ground instead of running. A flicker of surprise and admiration crossed his eyes. The group exchanged glances. The threat in the air shifted into caution. One of them drew out a phone as if to record or call for reinforcements, but Claire did not waver. After several tense moments, the leader withdrew in frustration and said this time they would let it pass, but they would not forget. They left, yet the weight of what remained lingered. Claire sat back down, her hands trembling slightly, her heart racing, yet inside her a surge of victory rose. She had stood up for the first time. She had neither fled nor bowed. That courage had not only driven away her harassers, but had awakened a sense of inner power she had never felt before. Nick came to her side, his voice low with undisguised respect. He said he had not thought she would do that she had stood up. Claire gave a tired but proud smile, and said she could not keep running forever. If she wanted to live, she had to learn to stand for herself. Nick sat beside her without another word, but the slight nod and the steady focus in his eyes told her that what she had done had changed how he saw her. For the first time, Claire understood that strength did not always come from weapons or authority. Sometimes it simply came from daring to face fear and hold one's ground. She was no longer someone swept along by the current of events, but a participant who could shape part of her own fate. That moment passed in silence. Yet deep within, Claire knew she had opened a new door, the door of power, of confidence, of the ability to shape her life in her own way, even as the world around her remained filled with danger and uncertainty. She exhaled slowly, feeling the fatigue and emptiness drain from her body, replaced by a fierce awareness that from this point on, she would not be easily broken again. Nick sat beside her, observing, taking it in, and even without words, he understood that a new chapter had begun, not only for Claire, but for what was growing between them, something built on respect, trust, and the inner strength they had just discovered. That evening after the incident at the cafe, Nick led Claire to the underground apartment he had prepared in advance. The place was not luxurious, only just sufficient for a sense of safety to exist while still preserving privacy. Nick sat down beside the old wooden table, his gaze heavy with thought as he looked at her. "Claire," he began in a low voice, unhurried yet weighted with meaning, "perhaps you have never truly seen what my world is like." Claire remained still, listening, a quiet tension spreading through her body. Nick spoke of his childhood and his family, of how loyalty was not merely a promise but an obligation, and how betrayal could kill and destroy entire bloodlines. He told her of relatives who had been betrayed for the sake of power, of allies eliminated for a single wrong decision, of how every move was carefully calculated yet always soaked in risk. Claire watched him and realized she was seeing a different image of Nick now, not the cold and commanding man she had known before, but someone carrying immense responsibility and deep unseen wounds. He exhaled slowly and said that he had lived his entire life between loyalty and betrayal, that learning to trust was painfully difficult. But today, Claire, you stood up. You did not run. You did not bow before threats. And that is what makes me begin to trust you. Claire was surprised, not by the praise itself, but by the feeling, for the first time, of having her strength taken seriously. Nick went on to speak of people he had encountered in his life, those who swore loyalty only to betray him in a heartbeat, and of the lessons he had learned from them. Never judge by appearances, but never forget the warning signs either. Claire saw in his eyes both caution and respect, something she had never truly received from anyone before. He looked deeply into her eyes, his voice softer now, carrying a rare trace of emotion. "I believe you can stand in this world without leaning on anyone, yet be wise enough to know when to be careful. That is rare." Claire drew a deep breath, feeling the weight and pressure within her ease, replaced by a warmth she could not fully explain, a trust beginning to take shape between two people from entirely different worlds. In that brief silence, she realized that not only was she learning to trust herself, but Nick was also learning how to open himself to another person. He spoke of how he had always doubted every relationship, how he controlled information, and the actions of those around him to keep himself and his family safe. But Claire, through her courage and resolve that day, had forced him to reconsider that rigid belief. He ended by admitting that for the first time in many years, he felt he could place genuine trust in someone, not because of power or strategy, but simply because of the honesty and bravery in her actions. Claire looked at Nick and felt a subtle yet powerful connection form between them, one built on trust, respect, and the understanding that in a ruthless world, loyalty still held meaning, and sometimes all it took was one person brave enough to prove it. The moment passed in silence, yet both understood that what had just happened had laid the foundation for a new kind of relationship, one no longer built solely on benefit or power, but on understanding, respect, and genuine trust. But the very next morning, the rain fell lightly, tiny droplets gathering on the glass of the familiar cafe where Claire and Nick often went. The warmth inside stood in stark contrast to the cold of the street outside. Claire sat on the far side of the table, moving her steaming cup of coffee aside to make room for the new book they had just begun. Nick arrived a few minutes late, stepping in with his dark coat damp with rain, his eyes, as always, sweeping the room once before settling on her. Claire smiled. He nodded in return. The lesson unfolded as it always did. They read, paused at difficult passages, and worked through meaning together. Neither of them noticed the man who entered midway through and sat alone near the door, half hidden by a tall plant. Not until Claire stood to retrieve some napkins, and the man suddenly approached her. He was tall, wearing a leather jacket, his face unremarkable, yet something in his eyes made Claire halt when they met. Not familiarity, but a strange deliberate awareness, as if he had known her for a long time. He did not smile, he did not shout, he spoke softly, only for her to hear, his voice even and cold as steel. He asked if she was Claire Dawson, the one who had saved the Merino boy. Claire stood still, her breathing slowed, the napkin still in her hand. She did not answer, but her eyes gave her away. The man's mouth tilted slightly. There was no hurry in him. He said he had only come to deliver a message from the Varga family. Tell Marino that saving a life doesn't cancel a debt. It just transfers it. He leaned in closer, his eyes lifeless. You're the collateral now, Claire. If he doesn't step down from the waterfront deal within 24 hours, the next time we meet won't be for a chat. Then he walked away as lightly as if he had only stopped to ask for the time. Nick was already on his feet, moving quickly to her side. He did not need to ask. One look at Claire's face was enough. She held herself steady as she told him what had been said. Nick's face darkened, not with surprise but with confirmation of what he had long feared. Claire was no longer an outsider in the eyes of his enemies. He called Dominic immediately, his voice short and sharp. Within minutes, 2 unfamiliar men entered the cafe without a word, nodded once to Nick, and signaled for Claire to come with them. She started to protest, but Nick caught her hand. For the first time, concern broke openly through his restraint. He told her this was not an empty threat. They had seen her face, and if she still wanted to live freely, she had to understand that freedom now came with risk. Claire said nothing. She only nodded. It felt as if the ground beneath her feet had shifted. All the peaceful days, all the quiet laughter over coffee and simple lines of text were now revealed as a fragile shell hiding a harsher truth. On the drive back, the car moved faster than usual. Claire sat in the rear seat, her eyes on the rain-smeared window, her thoughts spinning with helplessness. For the first time in many weeks, real fear found her, not because of the warning, but because her name had now entered a story with no exit. Her name, her face, her existence were now bound to the Marino bloodline and all that came with it. Nick did not turn to look at her, but his voice lowered when he spoke, as if confessing something he had never wanted to admit. He said he had tried to keep her at the edge, but it seemed that no longer worked. Claire closed her eyes, not from exhaustion, but because she needed a moment to swallow the trembling rising in her chest. She did not know what waited ahead, but it was clear that today's lesson was no longer an ordinary one. It was a warning, a sign that the storm behind the calm had begun to roll in. The next morning, Claire met Nick at his underground office, where dim light filtered through an old window and cast long shadows across the concrete floor. She stood straight, her voice firm, her eyes unwavering. Nick, I know you want to help, but I do not want to live under control or depend on your family. I need my own apartment, the right to decide my own life, and protection, but without taking part in your work or your family's world. Nick studied her in silence for several seconds, as if weighing every word, every intention. He drew in a slow breath and replied in a low voice that he understood. She did not want to be bound. She wanted independence but still needed safety, and he could arrange that. Claire felt her heartbeat quicken, but she did not falter. She knew this was a decisive step, the first time she was truly standing up to claim ownership over her life, and not many people dared to do that before Nick Marino. Nick instructed an assistant to prepare the legal documents, clearly laying out the terms of protection, privacy, and Claire's absolute independence. He said this was not only an agreement between the two of them, but also a safeguard to ensure she would not be drawn into the Mafia world or held accountable for anything connected to his family. When the documents were brought in, Claire took them and read each line carefully. Every clause was precise, but one paragraph stood out. It listed her officially as a private language consultant with a monthly salary that covered her living expenses and systematically deducted from the debt he had bought. It wasn't a gift, it was a job, a legitimate way to survive while keeping her dignity intact. Nick had found the only way to help her that she couldn't refuse. Nick committed to maintaining distance in her personal life. Claire signed each page, feeling as though every stroke of the pen engraved her resolve and the freedom she was claiming. Nick signed beneath her name, sealing his promise to protect her and respect her decision. The moment the pen left his hand, Claire felt a gentle wave pass through her, as though for the first time in many weeks she could truly breathe without fear of excessive surveillance or unwanted control. Nick observed her with a gaze that carried both respect and caution. He said he knew she could take care of herself, but he wanted to be certain she was always safe. If any threat arose, she would be warned and protected immediately. Every other choice would remain hers. Claire nodded, feeling relief but also recognizing the weight that freedom carried. She had reclaimed control over her life, and now she would also bear responsibility for the choices ahead. Nick offered a rare and sincere smile, and told her that she had proven herself worthy of this independence. He would keep his promise to protect her, but he would not interfere in her life unless it was truly necessary. Claire exhaled, her shoulders easing for the first time, feeling a fragile balance settle between power and freedom. She stepped out of the office carrying the keys to her new apartment, the agreement papers, and the sense that this was not merely a move of residence, but a declaration of self, a declaration that she could live independently, safely, and still retain the right to choose her own path. Even as the world remained dangerous and unseen forces continued to lurk, Claire knew she now had the means to protect herself, a safeguard from Nick that did not trespass upon her autonomy. The apartment was small but warm, the security measures firm yet not suffocating, and most importantly, for the first time in many weeks, Claire felt fully in command of her destiny, ready to face whatever lay ahead without running or leaning on anyone else. Claire began her first teaching sessions at the Adult Education Center, and for the first time in many weeks she felt she could breathe without constantly scanning every unfamiliar shadow. The classroom was small, the desks simple, natural light filtering through old windows to create a space that felt both welcoming and peaceful. She entered with a gentle smile, greeting each student, striving to create an atmosphere where learning could happen without judgment. The lessons unfolded as she explained each concept, guided the exercises, observed her students as they practiced, and encouraged them whenever they made mistakes, in the same way she had once wished someone would have believed in her when she was young. At the end of each day, she returned to her small apartment, prepared simple meals, tidied the space, and for the first time felt a sense of peace that belonged to her, at least in terms of time and physical safety. Yet that light of safety was only a fragile shell. When she went shopping or visited the library, Claire still noticed unfamiliar figures watching from a distance, black cars appearing more than once on the street corners she passed, silent, unknown calls filling her voicemail. The quiet of her apartment only created the illusion that she was completely safe. Each time she left the center, her heart leapt, her eyes never leaving the road ahead, alert to every movement around her, unease seeping into every step. In the afternoon, as she walked past the nearby park where elderly people and children played, she told herself that life could still be normal if she kept her distance and controlled her environment. But the darkness never fully withdrew. She still glimpsed strangers stopping to stare from afar, blurred shadows slipping across her windows as she cooked or read. She learned to balance between freedom and vigilance, between independence and the acceptance that she still needed certain measures of protection. The classroom became a refuge for her spirit, helping her restore faith in herself and in her ability to shape her life. Yet deep inside, Claire knew the outside world remained full of danger, and that every smile and every ordinary step could be shattered by forces she could not see. This sense of normal was both her salvation and her trial, demanding that she not only teach others but continually teach herself how to live in a world where true safety was never absolute. Claire began to understand that independence did not mean carelessness, and that every choice now had to be paired with awareness, vigilance, and the recognition of hidden threats always waiting just beyond sight, turning even the most peaceful days into exchanges between hope and unease. That afternoon, having picked up Leo for a promised ice cream treat, Claire stopped to buy a few necessities for her apartment. With the boy holding her hand, her steps were hurried yet controlled, her eyes scanning every street as part of a new habit she had formed. As she crossed a deserted intersection, an unnatural sound exploded behind her. A white van suddenly swerved to block the road, its rear doors flying open, and several masked figures surged out with terrifying speed. Claire's heart leapt, her body tightening like a drawn wire. She hurriedly grabbed her pepper spray, but partly from fear and shock, it had only limited effect. They weren't coming for her. They were reaching for Leo, who stood frozen beside her. Instinct took over. Claire didn't run. She threw herself over the boy, shielding his small body with her own just as the attacker swung the baton. She took the blow meant for the child. A sharp crack echoed. Pain exploded in her shoulder, but she held Leo tighter. "Don't touch him!" she screamed, just as Nick's security team swarmed the alley. Shouts erupted, bodies collided. The harsh ring of metal echoed through the narrow space, making Claire feel as though the world itself were shaking. One guard pulled her back behind the van while another struck the attacker with chilling accuracy, forcing them to halt and retreat. Claire felt a heavy impact as one assailant was thrown aside. She lost her footing. Her shoulder slammed against the edge of the vehicle and scraped open. Blood bloomed faintly across her blouse. Not yet dangerous, but real. Her heart thundered. Her breath came in ragged gasps. Yet she felt the force of protection closing around her, even as helplessness lingered in the grip of a life-or-death moment. The masked men scattered in panic, some fleeing into the dark alley, others subdued swiftly by the guards. The sound of frantic footsteps, broken cries, and the screech of the van's tires as it braked hard echoed through the empty street. Claire forced herself upright, her trembling hand wiping the blood from her shoulder. Her eyes stayed fixed on the last figures until she realized they were gone. Only the guards remained, sweeping the area to ensure it was secure. One approached her, his voice low and sharp with urgency, as he asked whether she was badly hurt, whether she felt pain anywhere. Claire shook her head. Only light scrapes, yet her body still trembled with adrenaline. Fear and tension lingered, as though her pulse had not yet slowed. Another guard quickly phoned Nick to report the situation while the rest checked every exit to ensure no threat remained. Claire stood still, drawing deep breaths as she tried to steady herself, staring at the empty street and realizing that no matter how much she wanted to believe she could protect herself alone, the world beyond still held dangers she could not face by herself. A little later, a black car from Nick arrived and stopped slowly in front of her. A guard guided her inside and locked the door behind her. A temporary sense of safety sealed the space. In the quiet of the vehicle, Claire silently wiped away her tears. Fear and relief tangled together as she accepted a truth she could no longer ignore. Even with a life that felt nearly normal, the darkness of the past and hidden vendettas still followed every step she took. She needed protection, but she also needed to stay fully awake to survive. The car sped away from the scene, carrying Claire and the guards from the shattered intersection. The image burned itself into her memory as a reminder that freedom and safety had never walked easily side by side, and that sometimes hesitation or misplaced innocence could be paid for in blood, pain, and raw terror. 3 days after the attack, Nick summoned Claire to his office at the main villa, where golden light from crystal chandeliers reflected across the cold marble floors, creating an atmosphere that felt both dangerous and sovereign. He stood at the end of the hall, his gaze deep and his voice resonant. "Claire, I want you to move in here. Security will be complete. You will never be in danger again." Claire inhaled slowly, the weight of pressure settling across her shoulders, fully aware that refusal would not be easy. She looked around in silence at the family portraits and lavish decor, all radiating power, control, and confinement. "Nick, I appreciate the offer, but I do not want to live like a prisoner inside that safety. I need my own boundaries. I want independence, and I will not move into the villa," she said steadily, without bitterness. Nick frowned slightly, tension flickering in his eyes, but he listened. She continued that she was not refusing protection, but she wanted control over her own life. She wanted to decide where she lived, where she went, and what she did each day. She wanted freedom within the safety limits he set, but she refused to be completely bound to his world. Nick circled the desk, his voice low as he replied that he understood her desire for independence, but he could not allow any threat to reach her. There would be people who would not stop, people who had already searched for her more than once. Absolute safety did not exist if she stayed outside their control. Claire met his gaze without retreat. She said she understood the dangers and accepted the risks, but she would not trade away herself for perfect protection. She chose this path because it was true to who she was, not because she was afraid. Silence fell. Only the soft ticking of the clock filled the room. Nick frowned again, this time in deep consideration. He walked to the window, the late light cutting across his stern face. "The men who attacked you, the Vargas, won't be coming back. Over the past 3 days, my men have systematically dismantled their entire operation. The threat has been neutralized permanently." He turned back to her, his expression softening slightly. "Because the immediate war is over, I can agree to your terms. I respect your choice, but understand this. Peace in my world is always temporary. However, I promise you this. If any new threat arises, we will intervene immediately." Claire felt her heart pounding. Relief and tension braided together as she realized she had successfully negotiated her independence while retaining necessary protection. She told him that she would keep those boundaries, but she wanted to continue helping Nick learn, and she wanted her life to belong to her, not to him or his family. Nick nodded, his face still firm but his eyes showing trust. He said she had proven she could make her own decisions and understood the value of freedom. They would honor that, but she must never forget that danger always existed. She was choosing what was imperfect, but it was her choice. That, he said, was the difference between one who fled and one who survived. Claire exhaled, exhaustion and strength flowing through her at once. She knew she now stood at the threshold of a new life, one where choices would never be easy, but for the first time, she was the one holding the reins. Her heart eased in quiet relief, understanding that perfect peace and flawless safety did not exist, but living with decisions that belonged to her, even when imperfect, was what gave her true strength. She left the office knowing the life ahead was still full of danger, but this time she walked with steadiness, confidence in herself, and the readiness to face the world in a way only she could choose. Claire sat on the sofa, in her own apartment, looking out through the window as the light of sunset gilded the towering buildings and the crowded street below. A feeling of both relief and emptiness moved quietly through her mind. She thought back to the fateful morning when she had missed the most important interview of her life, when she had let slip the chance to escape debt and a grinding existence in order to save Nicholas Marino, a stranger who had now become the center of a hidden part of her world. The disappointment over the lost job still ached within her, yet she could now see the larger picture. She had conditional freedom. She was living by her own decisions without being completely dependent on Nick's power or his family. Over the past weeks, as she taught and guided Nick through lessons in libraries and cafes, she had discovered a sense of self-worth that no one could take from her. Trust between her and Nick had slowly taken shape, not as the wealthy protecting the weak, but as a quiet recognition of her capability, her courage, and the integrity of her choices. Claire felt clearly that someone needed her, and that feeling was beyond anything else. Not love, not family attachment, but true presence, a relationship built on mutual respect and trust. She remembered the watchers and the dangers that shadowed her steps, and she realized that those dangers, rather than being only terror, had taught her the true value of choice and of control over her own life. Though she had lost the future she once imagined, she had built a new rhythm, imperfect yet real, one in which she directed her own steps, where every decision, small or great, belonged to her. She felt the difference between fleeing and living, between being dictated to and choosing for herself. For the first time in many years, she did not feel alone. In a world saturated with danger and power, Claire Dawson found her own place, her confidence, and a clear sense of purpose. As she looked down at the table where papers, books, and her phone lay neatly arranged, she knew the road ahead would be long, filled with trials and hard decisions. But now she had learned to face them in her own way. She offered a faint smile and drew a deep breath as stillness settled into every part of her body. She realized that she had lost certain things, but in return she had built what she had never believed she would possess: self-determination, trust in herself, and a sincere connection with someone who truly needed her. Claire stood and walked toward the window, gazing out at the restless city. And for the first time in many months, she saw that light was not only the sun spilling through glass, but also the presence of hope inside her own soul. Loss and trial had shaped her, but it was her own decisions that had forged her strength and her path. She knew she would still face danger, hard choices, and imperfect outcomes. But now Claire was ready to move forward, carrying the freedom, the faith, and the purpose she had found in a world she had never wanted to enter, yet which had now become an inseparable part of her life. At dawn, Claire Dawson awoke in her small yet warm apartment, an unfamiliar sense of peace quietly slipping into every corner after many weeks of tension and fear. She prepared for her lesson with Nicholas Marino, which had now become a familiar part of her new rhythm of life. Even though she had never wanted to enter that world in the beginning, she brewed a cup of hot coffee, sat down at the table by the window, and opened her notebook to review the day's lesson, feeling each ordinary minute as something rare and precious. When she arrived at the library, Nicholas was already waiting, his bag placed neatly beside him, his face brighter than she had ever seen before. They began the lesson as usual, exchanging ideas, explaining concepts, and laughing together when they stumbled over difficult questions. The sense of normalcy, simple yet deeply connected, allowed both of them to forget for a moment the dangers that had once surrounded them. In the middle of the lesson, Nick suddenly stopped writing. He looked up at her, a rare vulnerability in his eyes. He hesitated for a moment, then spoke softly. "I did it, Claire. Last night I read The Little Prince to Leo. He fell asleep listening to my voice. Thank you." Claire smiled, a surge of happiness and pride rising within her, as she realized that her efforts had not only helped him, but had also brought meaning back into her own life. She drew in a slow breath and looked out through the library window, where sunlight streamed through the treetops, golden leaves drifting in the wind. In that moment she understood that this world, however complex and dangerous, still held unexpectedly beautiful and peaceful moments. Everything she had lived through taught her that doing the right thing sometimes came with loss, yet it could also open doors to values and opportunities that money and status could never buy. It taught her that courage, honesty, and human compassion could change the course of an entire life. Claire understood that happiness did not always arrive in the form we expected, but if one remained true to oneself, found purpose, and built genuine connections, one could create a life that was worth living, rich with meaning and value. The story of Claire and Nicholas reminds us that every choice, whether small or great, carries responsibility and the power to transform. Sometimes sacrifice and care for others become the very path that leads us to our own freedom and happiness. If you enjoyed this story, please remember to subscribe to our channel, press like, and share this video so you can join us for many more powerful stories every day. We invite you to share your thoughts from the heart. Have you ever faced a moment where you had to choose between safety and doing what was right? Did this story awaken something familiar in your own life? We truly look forward to reading your comments and hearing your deepest feelings as we share the values of life together. Goodbye for now, and we will see you again in the next video. We wish everyone watching good health, a joyful life, peaceful days, and renewed energy each morning. Farewell, and until we meet again in the stories to come.